There's no convincing evidence that couldn't be better explained by natural laws. And so, where's that I know of, at least, and that people who think the way I do know of. So I guess where is the evidence that God exists? And if you don't, and do you accept that the burden of proof lies with the people claiming that gods do exist?
Okay, here's the way I work that through. Like it or not, you and I have to answer the questions. Where do I come from? Because that is tied to our worth, value. Why do we value our lives? Why do we value other people? Where do I come from? Secondly, why am I here? Obviously, you're not here by accident. You're a highly motivated person, so obviously you have defined there to be a purpose of your life. That's why you have the motives you do. That's why you have the ambitions you do. Thirdly, now that I am here, how am I going to live my life ethically? How am I going to treat people? So what's the basis of your ethics? And then fourthly, is there life after death or is there not? And like it or not, because we all have a date with death, all of us have to ask the question, is there life after death or is my death the fertilizer pit? And that's it. So like it or not, we all answer those questions, and none of those answers are scientific. They're all philosophical.
I would say that they're scientific.
How can you scientifically show the value of somebody?
If you have a theory that there is life after death, the only way that you would be able to convince anybody that that theory is true is if you would be able to demonstrate that fact, right? Like, why would I believe anything anybody says if they can't show me that it's true? If I told you that the Santa Claus exists, for example, you would demand some rigorous demonstration of Santa Claus's existence, wouldn't you? Like what would be a non-scientific way for you to believe that Santa Claus exists? Sorry, everyone, Santa Claus doesn't exist.
As I was saying, you cannot scientifically show the value of a human life. You cannot scientifically show. All right, do it.
First, define what value is.
Yeah, how can you scientifically show that a life is valuable?
Give me a definition of value, and then I'll scientifically show you the value of human life.
Valuable means having worth, having significance.
Those are synonyms, but like
having an intrinsic value, an innate value, worth, significance. That's what I mean.
I think what you mean by value is that there has to be somebody that wants that thing. Like that's, I think that we both understand what value means. That's the intuition. But right there, you need a person in order for there to be value to something. If there were no people, I would say that the value of a tree would be very different than if there were people around.
Science has nothing to say about the purpose of a life. Science simply is a very precise, organized investigation of material order and reality. And I celebrate science. But it is totally different to ask the question, what is the purpose of this body? Science studies the body. Philosophy, theology, and ethics ask the question, what is the purpose of this body?
So, what do you mean by purpose? I mean, that's another, like, along with value, you're using words that have maybe ambiguous meanings, not very solid meanings, and I think that it's giving the illusion that you're giving an argument, but I think most people, when they're hearing that, they're really not sure why that would be convincing. I think I gave a pretty good argument for why value is actually something that you can scientifically investigate. Purpose, I think that that's something that implies that there isn't some agent, right, with desires and intentions. So what is the purpose of what I do? Well, I guess that would depend on what I desire and what I want. So really, purpose is just like maybe an extension of value. But I don't think that these are, and going back to what you said about philosophy versus science. I mean, I agree that science itself is a philosophy. It's a system of belief built on some assumptions. One of which being is that nature follows laws, and therefore, if we can understand the laws of nature, we can predict the future because nature will consistently follow laws. I think that that is a much more useful belief than to believe that reality is actually the subject to the will of an unseen agent. Because in that kind of belief gives you zero predictive ability unless that agent has to follow some laws. And I don't know that you believe that God does have to follow laws or what, but I mean, if God perfectly follows laws, why assume that God even exists? Why not just assume that the laws exist, like a scientific belief system does? But I think we're getting off track. Like, back to like, what is the solid evidence that God exists? And do you agree that you have to give evidence that God exists? Because I don't think value, purpose, these sort of vague ideas really constitute evidence. They're not well defined.
The reason that I went through those 4 points was to try and show you that we all have to answer questions that are crucial to our lives that have nothing to do with science. Worth, purpose, ethics, hope for the future, life after death are 4 questions that all of us have to answer, and we can't scientifically prove that our answers are correct. Instead, we use logic and reason. We look at the evidence, and then we make our decisions, hopefully, based on evidence, not science, but based on logic, reason, and philosophy. Second point, in answer to your question, why do I believe God exists? Not because I can scientifically prove God. But the reason I pointed out the importance of those 4 questions was to try and begin to open your mind to realizing that the way you live your life is not based on science. Instead, the way you live your life is based on reason and logic far more than science when it comes to, does life have worth and value? Is there a purpose to life? Ethically, how am I going to live my life? Is there a right and wrong or no? Or is it all a crapshoot? And is there hope for life after death or not?
Yeah, I agree that we do live our life using reason and logic. And I actually, you can believe, I believe that it is logical to believe some things that aren't true. Like, if it means your survival, then sure, maybe believing the same beliefs as everyone around you is a good idea.
I disagree.
Or if it just gives you comfort.
I disagree.
But
I am not going to believe something is true simply because everybody else believes it. I'm not going to believe something is true just because it brings me comfort. I, as a thinking human being, long to be in touch with reality. Reality is that which is true. And if it's not true, I'm not going to believe it. And guess what? If you offer me $1 million to believe that there's a pink elephant right here, although I might tell you, oh yeah, I believe there's a pink elephant right here, I can't do it. My mind will not allow me to believe, even if you offer me $1 million, that there's a pink elephant right here. Now think about that, guys.
Is there a pink elephant?
No, there's no pink elephant right here.
How about a god?
Yes, there is a God right here. There sure is.
I don't
And
think
the
so.
reason that I'm convinced there is a God right here is because order and design demand an intelligent mind.
No, I don't think so.
I know so. I know that this sweater did not come about as a result of a
I
hurricane
think randomness
passing through a cotton
demands a
field.
God more than
I know
order.
that it's difficult to put a basketball through a hoop 10 feet off the ground because I wanted to play major college basketball in North Carolina, and guess what? I could not put that ball through the hoop 10 feet off the ground as well as other guys could. Therefore, I sat the bench. I had front row seats for every game. Why? Because it's real hard to put a ball through a hoop 10 feet off the ground. It doesn't happen by accident. It involves intention. It involves coordination. It involves a mind.
All right, so if you're invoking a mind is evidence for God, like, I think that a more useful assumption about the mind is that there's actually physical laws that govern what we call the mind and how it behaves. And it is more useful. Like, that's why we have neuroscience and psychology.
Yeah, we
Neuroscience and
study
psychology-
physical reality. I'm aware of that. But that still doesn't change the fact that you have to ask yourself, is it reasonable to believe that randomness produces fine-tuning? Is it reasonable to believe that the non-rational has produced the rational? If you're an atheist, you're saying, my rational mind comes about as a result of non-reason. I find that to be highly implausible. The rational mind points me to the fact that there must be some type of rational being who created me with a rational mind.
You're assuming that.
No, I'm not assuming that.
Yeah, there.
The evidence is you have a rational mind. Now, is it more plausible for me to believe that behind your rational mind is a non-reason, or is it more rational for me to believe that behind your rational mind is a rational mind who created you?
Minds aren't totally rational anyway.
I never said they were totally rational. But we wouldn't be having this conversation right now if you were not somewhat rational, and if I was not somewhat rational.
So there's like a rational part of our mind that comes from some other rational mind, and maybe a rational mind is behind that rational mind, and then so on to infinity? Like,
no.
What's the...
We don't have an infinite
You're not
regress.
explaining anything.
Yes, I am. I'm
just
telling you
pushing
flat
the
out
problem back a
that the
little further
reason
with
this
the
guy has a
reason.
rational mind is not because non-reason produced reason. It's because there's a rational creator who created us and gave us a rational mind.
I hope this
And that makes
isn't
far more sense to
convincing
me
anybody,
than to believe that
right?
his rational mind came from non-reason.
I mean, we clearly evolved from animals that had...
So what? That you've evaded the question. The question is, behind whatever process we came about by,
You're
be it
just
evolution or
assuming
whatever,
rationality
is
has
it
to
more
come
reasonable
from
to
another
believe that there's an
rationality, and that
intelligent
doesn't make
mind,
sense.
or is it more reasonable to believe that there's no intelligent mind behind
It is
it?
not reasonable to explain everything that you don't understand with an agent, a
That is not
rational
the point.
agent.
You missed my point.
No, I understand your point. You think that
Well,
the
then
only thing
please,
that can
please,
explain
please
a
respect it a
rational
little more
mind
by
is another
quoting me
rational
more
mind.
accurately. My point is not
No,
we explain
you
everything we
don't
don't
need to say,
understand
"I
by
understand
saying
your
it's
point."
God. That is not the point. The point is, what is more reasonable? Here's the question. What is more
You're saying it's
reasonable?
turtles all the
What
way
is
down.
more plausible? To say reason comes from non-reason, or to say reason comes from reason? What's more plausible? I'll say it one more time for you. What's more plausible? To say reason comes from reason, or to say reason comes from non-reason?
Reason comes from non-reason.
We disagree. I
Yeah,
strongly
mean,
disagree.
And that's what we're talking about, is that your belief in God is an assumption. And
No,
then
it is
that's
not an
fine,
assumption.
But you need to admit that.
No, it is not an assumption.
Yeah, you're
It is looking
assuming
at
that
the
reason
evidence
can only come from
of
reason,
reality,
which, by the way,
looking
is
at the
a
evidence of my life,
non-explanation.
and
Where
concluding
did that reason
it is
come
far
from?
more plausible to believe that there's a rational mind behind my reason than it is to believe that non-reason is
So
behind
where's
my
the
rational mind.
mind behind the rational mind behind your reason?
Obviously, you know, if you've read the Bible at all, that the claim of the
I've read
Bible
the
is
entire
that
Bible.
God is an eternal being who has no beginning. In other words, God is an uncaused cause.
So
You cannot have an infinite regress where it just goes mind, there's an irrational mind behind that, which is a rational mind behind that.
Intelligence is pretty hard to believe too. Like, I think we see evolution. We see simple things evolving into complex things. You
Good.
can actually design complex things and solve problems using an evolutionary algorithm. We've seen reason come from non-reason. It's all around us. We have not seen a magical, super powerful, omniscient being that creates universes. Like all of that. Like, why would anyone believe that? I mean, I understand why
I'll tell you
someone
why.
would believe it, but
Would
it's
you
an
please
assumption.
prove to me scientifically that unless you can prove scientifically something, it's not true? Would you please prove to me scientifically that unless I can prove something scientifically, it's not true? You see, you have a philosophy, and your philosophy is, unless I can prove something scientifically, it's not true. So that's a philosophy. It's a self-defeating philosophy, because you can't prove scientifically that unless you can prove something scientifically, it's not true. That's a philosophy that you have blindly embraced. It's a philosophical presupposition that you blindly embraced. I happen to strongly disagree with you. It's a self-defeating position. The whole idea, unless I can scientifically prove something, is not true. You cannot scientifically prove. You cannot prove to me that all truth has to be scientifically proved. That's exactly what you're doing out here.
No, that's not what I'm doing.
Yes, it is.
I told you already what the assumptions of the philosophy of science are, right? And
No,
I'm
you've
asking
not.
you, what are the assumptions of religion?
I've begun to answer your question by showing you the evidence for God's existence. The first piece of evidence is order and design point to a designer. The second piece of evidence is rational minds point to not non-reason, but to a rational creator who creates us and gives us this rational mind. I love Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin in 18-something wrote a letter to a man named Mr. Graham. And in this letter, Charles Darwin writes to Mr. Graham, in light of the fact that our brains are simply highly developed monkey brains, why do we trust our brains to tell us the truth? Would you trust the thoughts of a monkey? I respect Charles Darwin because he's struggling with epistemological nihilism, which is just a fancy way of saying, how do you know anything? And why are you convinced that what you do know is true? Would you trust the thoughts of a monkey? Yeah, that's a very good question. And if you believe that reason comes from non-reason, you're up a creek without a paddle when it comes to explaining why do you trust your mind to tell you the truth when you say reason comes from non-reason.
There's a good answer to that.
Oh, yeah, well, great, give it to me.
When you make the scientific assumptions that there are natural laws that can explain everything, life, intelligence, rationality, you're actually able to use that better. Everything we see around us is because of science, not because, well, religion has an important role to play in a culture, but technological advances, like our ability to really do things in the natural world, come about because of our scientific philosophy rather than a religious philosophy. If we believe that there is a mind with a will of its own that is behind the reality that we live in, we can't do anything with that, because you can't predict a mind that you can't see. You can't if God is like, a human with similar desires to us, the way he's depicted in the Bible or some of the other mythologies. Sure, there is some level of prediction there, but it's not nearly as useful as the laws of nature. Assume if we come across something we don't understand, are we going to say God did it and then throw up our hands and give up? Or are we going to say there might be a good natural explanation for this? Let's investigate under those assumptions.
When I was talking with that gentleman, not once did we talk about Scripture. He was asking me, why do you believe God exists?
Yeah.
Not once did I say, because the Bible says so. I don't believe God exists because a book tells me God exists. I believe God exists because order and design in the universe point me to a designer. I believe God exists because moral absolutes that I experience point to a moral lawgiver. I believe that God exists because I have a rational mind, and it's far more reasonable to me to believe that behind my rational mind lies a rational mind, a creator, than it is for me to believe that my rational mind comes from the irrational or non-reason. It's far more rational for me to believe that human consciousness comes from a conscious being, then that human consciousness comes from unconsciousness. That's why I believe God exists. Not because the Bible or the Quran or any other book tells me God exists. Have you ever asked yourself, why is it so hard to love people? The Bible's answer is that we are all sinners. We're all flawed. We hurt each other. That's why it's so difficult to love each other. When it comes to marriage, it can be incredibly difficult to love each other, can't it? The truth is, we always marry the wrong person. When we date, we always put our best foot forward. We don't really know the person we married. And if by chance we do marry the right person, that changes quickly, because marriage changes all of us. Why is it so hard to love each other? In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, the Apostle Paul writes, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." That's a dirty word in our culture, isn't it? Submit. It has in it the idea of subservience. It has in it the idea of being low life, of being a doormat. Nothing could be further from the truth. To submit to someone means to yield in love to another. And so just before he talks about marriage, Paul writes, "Submit to one another." In other words, yield to one another in love. Then he goes on and calls husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave his life for her. Do you want a good marriage? Then love your spouse the same way Christ has loved you. Sacrifice for your spouse the same way Jesus Christ has sacrificed for you. When you understand the cross of Christ, when you put your faith in him, he strengthens you so that you can be free to live a life of sacrifice. Often I hear people say something to the effect, marriage is oppressive, because Paul says submit to one another, and he goes on and writes, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church." Well, what type of head was Christ of the church? Before he went to his crucifixion, he huddled with his disciples, took off his outer garments, put a towel around his waist, and washed his disciples' feet. Jesus Christ was the quintessential servant leader. He did not lord it over anybody. When Jesus told his disciples that he was going to the cross, that he was going to die, instead of seeking to comfort him, James and John come up to him and say, "Hey, when you come into your kingdom, when you come into your real power and glory, could one of us sit on your right and the other on your left?" They were so self-absorbed, it was scary. And that is why it is so hard to love. Because love is the opposite of self-absorption. To love is to give. To love is to sacrifice. To love is to give your attention to someone else. To love is to watch another person keenly enough so that you know what they need and you can begin to meet their needs. And that's hard. That's hard living in a culture of narcissism. Our culture is breathing down our necks. What's in it for you? What's in it for you? What's in it for me? What's in it for me? I deserve a break. I deserve to have my needs met. And when that is the consistent mantra in a friendship or a marriage, it leads to a breakup. It leads to an incredibly superficial marriage or friendship. Marriage and friendship work to the degree that our love for each other approximates the love of Christ, which is a sacrificial love. In your marriage, in your friendships, on a day-by-day basis, there are three possibilities. You can serve someone with a chip on your shoulder. You can serve someone joyfully. Or you can simply be totally self-absorbed. Each day you and I have to decide, am I going to serve with a chip on my shoulder, resenting it? Am I going to serve joyfully? Or am I going to be so self-absorbed that I don't serve at all? The quality of your friendship, the quality of your marriage will be determined by how closely you can approximate the sacrificial love of Christ and thereby joyfully serve the other. What's the problem with self-absorption? What's the problem with self-centeredness? What's the problem with selfishness and narcissism? Well, it's rather simple. It makes us irritable. It makes us impatient. There's a lack of graciousness and kindness in the way we speak to each other. And we get downright jealous and envious. Because we're always focused on, why does that person have more than I do? I'm jealous of what they have. You see, Jesus Christ wants to cut us out of the straitjacket of self-centeredness. And how does he do that? By humbling himself. He's God. He humbles himself and becomes a human being. He lives a sinless life, and then he bleeds and dies on a cross for you and for me. And then Jesus says, follow me. Put your faith in me. Trust in me. And then when you live in the security of his love, when you put your faith in him and allow Christ to be the foundation of your life, he gives you the strength. He frees you to live a life not of self-absorption, but of sacrificial service. And that, friends, makes life go round and round. That makes for an excellent friendship, for a tremendous marriage. God bless you as you put your faith in Christ, as you respect him and love him and worship him and adore him and learn to trust him more and more. And then as you reach out to give your attention to others, not to be self-absorbed, not to serve with a chip on your shoulder, but actually to learn to give your life to others in serving them with delight. That is by far the most exciting, the most delightful, the most fulfilling life possible. God bless you as you trust in Jesus Christ and follow him.